Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The Trump administration is working really hard to move on from so-called Signalgate. This is the controversy around the mistaken sharing of war plans on the commercial messaging app Signal. We've all done it, right? Emailed the wrong person or replied all. It just felt different when it involved war plans and it was the U.S. government. Now, the White House spokesperson declaring this week it will not be repeated in the future, and the case has been closed. But there might be more to this story. I'm Kris McCusker, and in this episode of The Big Story, we speak to Christian Leuprecht, professor and security expert at Royal Military College, Queen's University. Now, this felt unusual, strange, unheard of. How did you see it?
I don't see it as any of that. Look, I mean, you're a journalist. You use messaging apps all the time to get your job done. Most of us do in our daily lives. Modern life moves very quickly, and modern political life moves even quicker, especially the security environment. And the challenge is that there's trade-offs. So we have secure communications facilities, but those are onerous for politicians to use because they usually either have to be at their house or they have to be at their place of work. And most politicians are often neither. They're at all sorts of events, meeting with all sorts of people. And so inherently, it happens in Ottawa all the time as well. Look, that people just communicate on things for expediency on apps. I mean, they use Signal, which is one of the more secure apps, I guess. The bigger problem is if you just have two people communicating, you can sort of control the security environment. I think there were 18 people on this chat. And so the problem is that if one of those phones is compromised, then the entire chat is compromised. And so that's really the risk when you have sort of that large a circle. And yes, on the one hand, you can say it violates both the law and it violates regulations in the way people are supposed to communicate, both in terms of security and in terms of being able to archive those types of decisions. But at the same time, we might also have a conversation about whether those laws and those requirements are still up to par for the 21st century. And look, I mean, everybody in the Prime Minister's office will tell you that when in doubt, they don't put things down in writing. They'll communicate on chat precisely because they don't want an official trace on some of this correspondence. And in this case, I think it was simply a matter of expediency. The problem is, of course, now adversaries have a heads up. So they now know whose phones they're going to double down on targeting, because they know if they get any one of those phones, they probably have good insights into the entire decision making in the executive branch of government.
Okay, what you've laid out there is very interesting. You make a bunch of really good points in there, in that, texting and doing things online is far more commonplace than it was 10, even 5 years ago. So that part of it, I understand. I guess I find it strange that the U.S. government is discussing an attack like this in a social media app that could be hacked.
Yeah, so look, I mean, this is not texting, right? This is messaging, and it is messaging using one of the most secure options out there. The problem is that anytime you use a phone, digital communication is never secure, and phones are notoriously insecure. So you can still have, even if you use an encrypted app with a high level of encryption like Signal, as long as one phone is compromised, your adversary is reading your entire communications. And even if they haven't compromised any of the phones, adversaries in Washington are still monitoring all the chats, so they can tell simply by the density of communication between devices that there's something up. So there's a number of things that you can take away from that in terms of valuable information that an adversary can glean.
And I guess the other problem that we need to highlight here is that a reporter was added to the chat inadvertently.
this is, I think, inherently where people are going to get a bit nervous here, right? So that this is what's known as operational security, making sure that only people who need to know are actually in the know, and that you only share information that is absolutely essential. And in this case, they broke both those basic rules of operational security. That is to say, they didn't have a tight control over the circle of people who were in the chat, and they shared information that I might contend went well beyond the absolute minimum you need to share for the purpose of the decision making and information in this particular case. And that's what's so it's going to have two implications. One is it's going to make people who serve quite nervous, because the impression will be that the administration deals a bit callously with people who putting their lives on the line for their country. And you might argue the Department of Defense already has recruitment challenges and other challenges. So this will certainly compound, for instance, recruitment challenges, retention challenges, and loyalty that people will show to their service and to their country. The others, of course, it has implications for allies, because allies will be concerned about what intelligence that Canada or other ally countries might share with the administration. Might it inadvertently share with perilous operational security? And of course, we saw this in the first Trump administration, when famously British UK provided intelligence ended out deliberately being leaked in political circles early on. Now, that was a one-off event. And the U.S. worked hard to reassure allies that it would not happen again. So it'll be interesting to see what the U.S. is going to do here to reassure both its own operations internally, as well as allies and partners, that this will be a one-off, and they've taken the necessary measures to ensure that this type of inadvertent disclosure doesn't happen again. And look, I mean, you can entirely imagine that the same person who might have added the journalist might have the Russian ambassador on their phone. So imagine, you end up adding the Russian or the Chinese ambassador to that type of to that type of chat. The Russians have shared intelligence, have an active intelligence sharing with Iran. And the Russians have also shared intelligence with the Houthis before. This is a bit of a boon for adversaries, both in terms of the delegitimization of the U.S. national security establishment and the operational information that was gleaned from the chats. And just there's a lot you can learn about how countries, especially the United States, for instance, run these types of operations. And so, you don't ever want to give your adversary a heads up.
Fair enough. The other thing I find interesting is the White House has since declared, the investigation's over. It's never going to happen again. We don't want to talk about this anymore, basically. And look over here, we're going to have this tariff announcement. So does that sort of tell us that the Trump administration realizes this was a gaffe, if nothing else, and let's distract with something else now?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different dynamics, I think, at work here. So the Trump administration has been very good, as we all know, at sort of flooding the zone. So, and distracting from one issue by simply having some bombastic and mercurial announcement about something else that then becomes the top of the news cycle. But there might be something else going on here. So I don't want to say that this was deliberate in terms of this reaching the public. But of course, this raid on the Houthis wasn't just an operational raid. It was also a signal to Iran. The Trump administration is trying to bring Iran to the table and find some negotiated deal on Iran's nuclear program on the one hand, but I think more broadly on Iran's ambitions in the region, because Iran is, of course, the major veto player in the region. So you might argue the Trump administration actually had a bit of an interest in having at least some of this conversation out in the public as a way to exert greater pressure on Iran in terms of the measures that the United States is prepared to take against Iranian proxies in the region. And Iran, having already been routed significantly by Israel, if more proxies are now routed, that will further reduce Iran's sway within the region. So it might also be perhaps sort of an unintended information operation by the Trump administration. Now, whether people are actually that smart or that strategic in the administration, I have my doubts. But certainly the Trump administration had some interest in having more details about this operation public as a way to try to contain and deter Iran and bring Iran to the negotiating table. Because, of course, we know that China has also been trying to bring Iran to the negotiating table. And so this is the Trump administration certainly trying to, this raid was as much a raid on the Houthis as it was a deliberate signal for Iran.
So if it was intentional, might we know that someday?
Well, so the Trump administration plays, in terms of information operations, it's very interesting, right? So my argument is always that the most important instrument of statecraft in the 21st century isn't political or economic or military or diplomatic power or whatever else. It is the information domain and owning the information domain. And if nothing else, we can certainly say that the Trump administration is doing a great job at owning the information domain and at making sure that it gets its version of the story out. Now, we might all disagree with that version of the story. We might find it objectionable or whatever else, but it is certainly about shaping the narrative and making sure that its narrative becomes the dominant narrative out there. And you can do this in a variety of ways. You can be mercurial, like the president himself. You can flood the zone with all sorts of types of initiative. But you can also have sort of these, we inadvertently added a journalist to our chat. Oh, look, that journalist is now going to publish something on our chat on precisely an issue where we're trying to exert pressure on Iran, both behind the scenes and militarily, and now, if you want, in a very sort of public way. So it's certainly also an interesting lesson in terms of information operations. Now, the Trump administration has, of course, tried to divert from attention to that matter. I don't think this was a deliberate information operation, but I would say, by and large, anybody who works in the the internal workings of government is not surprised that senior officials are communicating by signal. We live in a very dynamic world, in a very fast-moving world, and they will also not be surprised that they're sharing rather sensitive matters of operational security on signal. If this had happened in Ottawa, probably nobody would probably be paying much attention to it. But because it's the Trump administration, of course, this is a country where so far media freedom is still a very important part in holding a controversial administration to account. So we shouldn't be surprised that this generates significant international debate. And all the politicians from other countries, if you've noticed, have been surprisingly quiet about their criticism of the Trump administration, both because, of course, it is the Trump administration, everybody wants to be in their good books, but also because they all do it themselves.
You also see another takeaway here.
Look, my broad caution for the public is always, anytime you use your phone to communicate anything, you basically have to assume that it is public information. If you believe that you can have private, secure chats on your phone, think again. That is the broad takeaway.
So there's a lesson for all of us in this.
Absolutely. People think that somehow they can keep their digital communications secure and protected and classified. Yes, many people are callous with the information that they use and they give away. But the moment you do something on the phone, whether it's deliberate because your phone is compromised or it's inadvertent because you end up sharing information, as appears to have been the case here, in ways that you had never intended. And once it's out there, you're never taking it back.
The other question I have for you, just to wrap this up, is this something that we should sort of file away in the back of our mind? Like, I feel like this is one of those stories that might come up again over the course of the Trump administration's 4-year term. Is that your feeling as well, that this is sort of setting the tone for something that we might be coming back to this at some point?
So this is an administration that has substantial ambitions in the world and that has 2 years to the congressional midterm elections, where it's looking to get a lot done. And we know that it's very much looking to change the way business is done and what the U.S. role in the world is. And so we can expect that the administration is facing difficult compromises in the way it does things versus the effects that it's trying to achieve. And it seems to be being prepared to make considerable trade-offs in achieving effect and trading off operational security, the rule of law, and other elements that we would normally take for granted in the way the executive branch of government operates, let alone the U.S. executive branch of government. And so I suspect this is just part of the broader trade-offs the administration is making to achieve the impacts and effects that it feels it has been elected and mandated to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, it's doing things its own way, and this underlines that. Fair?
We live in a democracy, and look, we don't always like the outcomes, but we ultimately have to live with it. And you might argue that ultimately it will be up to the voters to pass their judgment in 2 years' time in the U.S. and the midterms, and in 4 years' time when it comes to the next presidential elections, as to whether the ways the current administration is using justify the ends that it is looking to achieve.
Thank you so much for doing this today. I really appreciate your time and your insight.
My pleasure.
Christian Leuprecht is professor and security expert at Royal Military College, Queen's University. And that wraps up this episode of The Big Story. You can follow us on X at The Big Story FPN and leave comments. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.